Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
He first came to notice, I think, when he was about 10 or 11 for some extraordinary, unpleasant, violent behaviours. So that's taken us back to the depths of the cuts into policing, into social services, into education services.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
This is the second episode exploring the horrific murders of 3 young girls in Southport on July the 29th, 2024, at the hands of the then 17-year-old Axel Rudakubana. In the last episode, we explored the riots which broke out after the attack. In this episode, we're going to look at what led to the tragedy. Not only the deaths of those 3 young children, but 8 other young girls were injured and 2 adults as well. Now that facts about the perpetrator and his background are in the public domain, we're going to look at what caused this crime and ask whether and how it could have been prevented and what we can learn to stop this kind of thing in the future. And to help us do that, we'll be joined again by Kevin Hurley, a former detective chief superintendent in the Metropolitan Police and an expert on public order and counter-terror. Martin, just remind us what happened on that day, July the 29th last year.
It was around 11:45 a.m. Axel Rudakubana, masked and hooded, entered the HeartSpace Dance School in Southport, where young girls were taking part in a Taylor Swift-themed children's dance class. It was the start of the summer holidays. It was the sort of thing that had been organised within the community. Rudakubana, he's wielding a large knife, goes on an absolutely horrific 12-minute killing spree, chasing the girls, stabbing some of them he catches, and dragging them back in as they try and run away. 3 girls, BB King, who was 6, Elsie Stankham, who was 7, and 9-year-old Elise da Silva Aguirre were fatally wounded. 8 other children, aged between 7 and 13, and 2 adults were also injured. Rudakubana was then arrested by police and later pleaded guilty to 16 charges, including murder and terror offences. He never showed any remorse or signs of cooperating with the authorities.
Martin, before we bring Kevin into the conversation, let's just talk through what we know about Axel Rudakubana's background and how he came to undertake his murderous rampage in the summer of 2024.
Yes, well, he was born in Cardiff in Wales to Rwandan Christian parents. The family, including Rudakubana's father, mother and older brother, moved from Wales to Bank in Lancashire, 5 miles from Southport. Then, during 2019, Axel Rudakubana comes to the attention of a range of local agencies due to his anxiety, social isolation, and challenging behaviour. In October that year, Rudakubana is excluded from school after telling Childline that he was being racially bullied and was bringing a knife into school to protect himself. In December, after his exclusion, he returns to the school and assaults someone with a hockey stick. The target is said to be a former bully he had a grievance with. He receives a youth justice referral order for the assault. That's a measure where juveniles who plead guilty to their first offence are placed under supervision to try to stop them reoffending.
But police then have several more interactions with him as a young teenager. I think they responded to 5 calls from his parents requesting help in dealing with his behaviour. On one of those occasions, he'd been caught carrying a knife on a bus, but officers didn't arrest him and instead took him home and gave his mother tips on keeping knives out of his reach, I think, Martin.
Yes, great advice, stating the bleeding obvious, really. But on each occasion, police do make vulnerable child referrals to what's called the Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub, or MASH for short. This body, which is chaired by a Lancashire Police Assistant Chief Constable, so a very senior officer, assesses and shares details with other local agencies whose task it is to keep children safe. The Lancashire Child Safeguarding Partnership undertakes an initial assessment and identifies that early help is required, but it doesn't recommend social work support for Rudakubana.
And then between December 2019 and April 2021, 3 referrals are also made from various schools that Rudakubana was attending to the government anti-extremism scheme Prevent.
Yes, this is really crucial, and perhaps it's the biggest scandal in all of this. So in November 2019, Rudakubana gets his first Prevent referral for researching school shootings during an IT class. Prevent officials say that the then 13-year-old is vulnerable, but there's no extremist ideology that they can identify, so they don't do anything. In April 2021, he has 2 more referrals to Prevent. He's been uploading to Instagram 2 images of Colonel Gaddafi, the late Libyan leader, and he was researching the London Bridge terror attack. Prevent officials again look at this, but they don't believe he poses a threat. All 3 cases from those referrals to Prevent are closed down without any action.
And then in February 2021, Rudakubana was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, an assessment which led him to receiving an education, health and care plan, an EHCP, and education services trying to find an appropriate school setting. In November 2021, police were then called again after Rudakubana kicked his father and damaged his car. And by 2023, he'd stopped engaging with mental health workers from Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, CAMS. He struggled to go to school, and his anxiety made him unwilling to leave his house.
Finally, in mid-July 2024, Rudakubana buys knives, and on the last day of school term, 22nd of July, he books a taxi to take him to his former school, apparently intending to kill there. But his father follows him out of the house and pleads with the taxi driver not to take him. So this potential attack is stopped. But a week later, tragically, Rudakubana isn't stopped, and for whatever reason, targets the dance class at the HeartSpace.
It's a sorry tale of missed early opportunities to intervene, and to help us explore what went wrong and how we might prevent an attack like this in the future, we're joined again by Kevin Hurley, former Surrey Police and Crime Commissioner and retired Detective Chief Superintendent in the Metropolitan Police, where from 2001 to 2005 he was the head of the Counter-Terrorism and Public Order Department for the City of London Police. Kevin, it's great to have you back on episode 2.
Pleasure.
Kevin, welcome back. Let's start with the whole question of terrorism and the government's anti-radicalisation programme, Prevent. It was introduced sometime after the 9/11 attacks on the United States. I just wondered, how aware were you of it at the time, you and your CT, counter-terror colleagues, in those years when you were head of counter-terror in the City of London? Did you at that point see the need for the programme Prevent?
Yes, because it was part of a wider programme of other stuff, which was Pursue. I think about 4 Ps: Prevent, Pursue. I can't remember the other ones. But yeah, I remember it well. And it was a well thought out strategy of dealing with what was perceived to be the terrorist threat to the UK. And indeed, when I was a police and crime commissioner, I had a member of the public come to me and was concerned about his son being radicalised in an East London mosque. He was a Surrey resident, and I referred this young lad to the local Prevent team because of the concerns of the dad.
Prevent had gone through several changes in the 15 years or so before Rudakubana was referred to it. But he was a classic problem kid who needed help from the Prevent mentors but didn't get it. Was the problem here, Kevin, as the Prime Minister has said, that we face a growing threat from young misfits like Rudakubana, who, to quote one of Martin's articles, are alone with a computer, their heads full of violent images and evil thoughts, and hell-bent on achieving notoriety, but without the fixed ideology of recognised terror groups.
Of course, that in itself is a problem, but underpinning that is the impact of austerity. Because if we look at the journey where he first came to notice, I think, when he was about 10 or 11 for some extraordinary, unpleasant, violent behaviours. So that's taken us back to the depths of the cuts into policing, into social services, into education services. And these are all the elements that should have been feeding to the prevent team people's concerns. And similarly, the people who are working on the prevent team, police officers, civilian staff or associated social workers from local authorities and so on, are all, or at the time, all being cut, all demoralised, all seeing their pay reduced, their staffing numbers being reduced. And of course, government has failed to deal with building in proper intelligence IT systems for public authorities to put information on which everybody can add to or access. So individual police forces are still not fully linked up on intelligence databases. Child protection systems of local authorities are not still fully linked up. All of that should have been fed together, because the reports that we hear that we've got is that he went to school once, broke someone's arm, I think, with a hockey stick. Another time pulled a knife out at school. I think was caught somewhere else with a knife. He had several interventions from local uniformed police and then some interactions with prevent staff. The question is, did those prevent staff firstly know about these other incidents? Was the databases complete on that? What was the social services engagement in some of this and education? Where was what everyone was thinking being fed together and collated? Because what it might well have led to, it could have done, is a case conference on child protection to decide, should this child be taken into care and become a looked after child for his own good, in that his parents are unable to manage him. Of course, politically very difficult to do because he's from an ethnic minority, so this is going to cause all different issues to come out. But it could have been possible for that boy to have been taken into care and the decision then be made, because of his unruly behaviour, that he will be put into secure, locked accommodation.
Kevin, talking about politically, Keir Starmer said that he wants the terror law to be changed. It's one of the many reviews that are going on in the wake of Southport. He wants updated terrorism laws to catch and prosecute as terrorists people like Rudakubana. But do you think a change in the law would stop a future Rudakubana?
No. Someone like Rudakubana is only going to have been stopped if the people who were engaging with him along the way are all kind of thinking, this doesn't look right. Let me talk to these people. What do you think? So, boss, we need to do something here. That's how you deal with someone like Rudakubana. Professional curiosity from a combination, social services, education, teachers, police officers, saying there is a problem here. Let's not either say it's all too difficult or slope shoulders. And we need to have the, if you like, the investment in those public services to do that. Whereas what we're actually looking at, because of the problems of the UK economy, is probably more austerity being imposed onto these various areas, because it's the easy ones to hit. To try and do cuts in the National Health Service, the sacred cow, or benefits are all things that the current government won't do. So more terrorism laws, what's it going to do? Not make a difference. He wouldn't have got more than 52 years and life sentences if he was charged with an act of terrorism. He got the absolute maximum a judge could give him anyway under standard common law, which is murder.
Critics of the government, Kevin, say that they're deliberately trying to shift the narrative to talking points about terrorism and the internet. Is this the story of the making of a terrorist, or a deeply disturbed, alienated loner of a young man or young teenager let down by children's and mental health professionals and slipping through the net?
Well, I think it's the latter. Whether or not he's let down by them or not, I wouldn't necessarily want to point the finger of blame at them. What I would say is that we have not got the same level of robust networks around these issues. And you see it all the time after time. That poor little girl murdered in Woking in Surrey, where the family all ran off to Pakistan. People knew that didn't sound right, didn't look right, and they didn't really intervene. And you had that other case, I think, of the 4 little boys, 2 twins, all recently died in a fire with the mum who'd had mental health problems. Frankly, the structure of society that we perhaps once had to deal with some of these challenges have all gone the way of cuts on austerity. Mentally disordered people care in the community instead of perhaps being in secure accommodation till we know they're safe.
Kevin, do you think we've got too many agencies that pitch in on occasions like this? And perhaps there should be one body to take responsibility.
I don't think there's too many agencies. What it needs is someone to grip it and have a case conference, and everyone who can add to it then comes along, because the people who could have added to this, just from my read of it, are uniform response officers who would have turned up, prevention staff, educationalists, someone from social services, but then someone needed to grip it and say, this boy looks like he's going to be a problem. Let's have a case conference and see how we're going to deal with it.
If you like the show and want to listen ad-free, head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. You can now subscribe to our ad-free tier for just £4 a month and get unlimited access to our entire back catalogue, completely uninterrupted.
Or if you love the show and want to support what we do, you can become a True Criminals Insider.
For just £3 a month, becoming an insider means you're directly supporting the podcast you love. Your support helps us create even more captivating stories and dive deeper into the most gripping true crime cases. It keeps the show going and the stories alive.
So whether you want ad-free listening or to help support the show, head over to patreon.com/True Criminals and choose the option that works for you.
Thanks for listening and for all your support. We couldn't do this without you.
From Creating History, the studio that brought you Creating Churchill, comes an all-new season of high-stakes diplomacy and backroom deals. This is Summitry. 13 episodes on the power, pressure, and politics when the world's leaders meet. From Hitler and Chamberlain's faithless handshake to Trump's mixed signals with Putin. Join us on Summitry, available now wherever you get your podcasts.
Kevin, we're all parents here, and we know that the Rudakubanas asked for help several times over concerns about their son. Where did they sit in terms of bearing responsibility for letting his behaviour get to that point?
I think it's a difficult one to blame parents on this kind of situation. If the person has got various mental or sociopathic issues, I'm not sure what parents can do. He's a teenager, mid-teens, strong, fit. How are the parents meant to discipline or control this person? In the end, I think he gave up because police pointed a taser at him, if I'm not mistaken, or threatened him with a baton. It's easy to blame the parents, but I'm not quite sure if they'd made a few requests for help there. It goes back to my point. Where is that network, that safety net of cases like this that will be picked up and looked up in the round by a body, whether it's run by social services, the police, educationists? Where is that? And I've got to say, I've dealt with many violent, nasty little pieces of work. You knew they were really, really bad. I remember one poured petrol through the door of an old couple who'd annoyed him, and they both died in a flat, got 7 years for that. But it was a right wrong on this kid, 15. No one knew how to deal with him or what to do with him, because we'd not really thought maybe we need to, for his benefit, take him into care. But then there's not the secure accommodation. There's not the investments in that, and there's not that acceptance that there are some children that, for their own safety and the benefit and protection of us, maybe they need to be kept in secure accommodation.
Yeah. And just for the record there, I wasn't suggesting blame to the parents. I'm sure they're absolutely heartbroken too. They've lost their son too, haven't they, in this horrific attack?
Correct.
Kevin, I just wanted to mention something else. Helen, I don't know if you know this, but Kevin and I first met 27 years ago in the middle of a riot.
I say.
Kevin will remember it. England fans on the rampage in Toulouse during the 1998 French World Cup. Kevin, you were there in charge of the British police. And I just wonder, because we've been talking about the riots that dominated the headlines after this attack, I just wondered your thoughts on the police lack of preparedness, certainly that first night of the riot in Southport. Is there a need for a mobile police riot squad for these occasions?
Well, let me just pick that off and use that example in Toulouse, because you're right. Right, there was a big riot going on. Hundreds of England football fans on a road 6 lanes wide, faced off by about 300 CRS police. And the way in which we stopped that riot is I got a loud hailer off the police and I went in front of them in a T-shirt and shorts, literally, and started talking to them with a loud hailer, saying, "My name's Kevin, I'm an English policeman, we've got a great football team, I know we've all had a good drink," and I started to talk with them. Just the management of that incident as it occurred in Southport, there could have been a case for a senior police officer to have got a loud hailer and said, "Look, we know everyone's angry, we're all upset, but this isn't going to help. I know we're all concerned," but someone just going forward and starting to talk to the crowd, it can be quite effective, because I've done it a few times in the past. But back to your point, full-time riot squad. So where we are, that costs a lot of money. Where's the money going to come from? The police can't investigate burglaries properly. They can't investigate domestic violence properly because there's not enough resources. You get your mobile phones stolen. The police can't deal with it. There's not enough resources. There's not only so much money in the pot. And if you were to have full-time riot police like the CRS, for example, in France, that money would need to come from somewhere. So I don't see where it would come from. There are, however, some dedicated full-time, more highly trained public order police in the big cities. The Met's got the Territorial Support Group. They've got the Tactical Aid Group in Manchester. I think they've got a similar thing up in Merseyside. Avon and Somerset, Bristol have got something. West Yorkshire, where they've got maybe 50-odd people who train more often in public order work. But you're never going to have them in the right place at the right time. So it all comes down to a well-organised structure within policing nationally where they can respond to each other, have adequate numbers of people to be mobilised to do public order work. Well, the problem you've got, again, with austerity is there's been a substantial reduction in the numbers of public order officers since 2011, where 17,000 police officers had to be brought into London after 4 days of rioting to stop that trouble. There isn't that availability. And the second point is, many police officers do not want to volunteer to do public order work anymore because it's high risk of them being caught on camera overreacting or using violence, and therefore they don't want to put themselves in a position where that will happen. So you've got a real problem the way things are now if we think we'd ever achieve that. So long answer to a short question is there isn't the money for it, Martin. And no one really wants to do that work in great numbers anyway. The answer is plan ahead, look ahead, and try and encourage officers to do that work as part-timers when they will do it. But I'm afraid the cuts to the police have been really significant. We've got the lowest numbers of police officers relative to most European populations in Europe at the current time, and the police are overwhelmed.
Kevin, with all the experience and the decades in senior policing that you've got, is it hard for you to sit and observe what goes on in a case like this when you see the dreadful stabbings and this brutal attack and then the nation up in arms and rioting? Is it hard for you to sit in your armchair when you probably know what should be happening or what you'd be doing if you were in charge?
Yeah, very hard, very hard. I can remember being fuming and phoning up various people in the 2011 riots. I can remember, in fact, I go on TV quite often talking now saying, this is not being handled right, the way in which they're holding back information for the Rudakubana case. Yeah, absolutely. And when I looked at how those riots first started off in Merseyside, I thought, a little bit of initial leadership from one or two of the inspectors or superintendents on the ground, instead of leaving their officers out like Aunt Sally's, could have dealt with that. So I watch it all the time. And the truth of the matter is, 2 years ago, I applied to run for Commissioner of the Met. Mark Rowley got the job. I got paper sifted. Probably they thought that was the best thing to do, the civil servants, because I'd have frightened them. But yeah, once policing is in your blood, doesn't matter what rank you are, you're still always mentally a police officer, male or female. You're still there on that white charger wanting to protect people even after you've left. If they took an approach of being a plumber, how you run a plumbing business, you wouldn't go far wrong. Because when your toilet's blocked up with crap, you want a plumber to come straight away. You don't care if they're black, white, male, female, gay, transvestite, or God knows what. You just want a competent plumber to come and solve your problem. And you want them to clean up the mess. You want them to go away and maybe a reassurance call afterwards. The public are the same. I've never been to an incident yet where someone says, I want someone from the city police or the Met, or I want a woman, or I want a black person, or I want a gay person. They just want their problem solved, and they just overcomplicate itself, roll over backwards. Oh, knife crime's out of control. Why is it out of control? No one will do stop and search anymore. We're all up in the air. For less than 1% of all public interactions the Met engage in is stop and search, of which probably less than 5% of them are a problem. And yet the whole Met's turned inside out. Oh, let's back off on black criminal. Oh, what a surprise. 16-year-old boy's just been shot dead yesterday on the Studley estate in Stockwell. The police have given up on the streets operation. You know that, Martin. Listen, this is another conversation.
Kevin, thank you so much for your insights. It's been a real privilege to have you on True Criminals, and we really do appreciate the time you spent chatting to Martin and myself today, don't we, Martin?
Kevin Hurley, the Met Commissioner. I'd have really enjoyed that, Kevin.
Martin, what struck me when Kevin was talking there is how difficult it must be for the parents and family of those involved in this tragedy, knowing that Axel Rudakubana was known to so many different care and protective agencies, yet in some ways slipped through the net. It seems that Kevin perhaps puts the blame on cutbacks and austerity measures.
Well, there are a number of things, aren't there, that Kevin talked about. And we asked him about where is parental responsibility, but there is lots of evidence that Rudakubana's parents were concerned, enough to call the police up to 5 times. And we talked about how his father stopped him the week before Southport, getting in a taxi and going off to his old school where maybe he'd have killed pupils there, who knows. So parental responsibility, it's difficult, isn't it? We're all parents. You've got troubled kids. How do you deal with them? But there are various agencies that it's their role, really, when parents can't cope, to take over. And Kevin, as he says about a lot of things, somebody should have got a grip. I suppose it's easy to say that, but I think he highlighted some issues about cutbacks, not just in policing, that perhaps contributed to police unpreparedness for the riots, but there's those austerity years where public spending was reduced on social services, mental health provision. And Kevin clearly believes that all that played a part in those occasions when agencies were aware of Rudakubana's troubled early teenage years, where they were engaged, where they did go and look at him for some reason, that people just didn't put 2 and 2 together and give Rudakubana the treatment, the help, the guidance, whatever was needed, that perhaps might have prevented what happened in Southport.
Kevin seems to have such a common sense approach. Are you getting any sense, Martin, as a journalist, that any lessons are being learned from this dreadful, dreadful atrocity, and that some of those agencies may work better in the future, or are you not getting any hint of that?
I think it's difficult to say. There's been such a focus on what happened. People are so appalled about Rudakubana's actions and those mistakes that were made, those so many missed opportunities to intervene. And there are a number of reviews that have been put in place The Prime Minister's got personally involved, and he's vowed that things will change. And of course, we hope that they will. And there's talk about changing the terror laws and accent more on identifying young kids like Rudakubana, disillusioned for whatever reason, obsessed with violence, who aren't necessarily driven by any identifiable ideology. That's why he's not classified as a terrorist. But there must be a way of identifying somebody as troubled as him where they're not defined by the definition of terrorism. I think it's going to be some years before we know whether those reviews are going to have any effect. And while all that examination is going on, people just hope that there isn't another Rudakubana out there ready to strike.
We've examined some real complexities of this case. I think Kevin has been a fantastic guest over our 2 episodes, giving us absolutely brilliant insight into what may or may not have been going on behind the scenes, and in many cases what he believes should have been going on and wasn't. But at the heart of this, Martin, I just can't stop thinking about the families. It's not even been a year since this tragedy, and you read a quote, I think, from Alice's parents from the court, and you realise that in that heartbeat, their joy and happiness has been extinguished out of nowhere. Their daughters were at a Taylor Swift dance class. I just can't get them out of my mind.
No, and if anybody was tempted to dismiss or not dwell perhaps as much as we should on the horror that their children went through and the difficulties that they are going to have to face for the rest of their lives, you only had to listen to those victim impact statements. I've talked about Alice's parents, what they said, but I think if you listened to what they said, those statements that some of them read out in court, some were read by the prosecution lawyers, you really did get a sense of the real impact that Rudakubana's actions had on that day. But it went beyond that because they gave their impact statements in court just before the judge gave his sentencing remarks and then sentenced Rudakubana to 52 years. And some of the parents have spoken out since then and given even greater insights into the effect that it's had on them. And they made the point in one TV interview I watched that they were speaking again after the sentencing because they didn't want the judge to have the last word. And they were particularly thinking of those moments where the judge, for very obvious reasons, went into the harrowing detail of what Rudakubana did. And I always remember the reference from the judge of one of the victims being stabbed 122 times. It's difficult to imagine what would have been left of a small child who'd been stabbed that many times. And the parents were absolutely adamant that they didn't want the greater public to have that image, that last image in their mind. They wanted to talk and give TV interviews and talk about the joy that their children brought them and how wonderful they were. And they wanted the greater public to have that perhaps as a lasting image in their minds, not the words, the harrowing words of the judge describing what Rudakubana had done to those children.
Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.